In a stunning turn of events, a serial killer was convicted without a shred of evidence. No body, no witnesses, no motive. The prosecution's case relied on a chilling pattern. Each victim was a young woman, targeted in the dead of night. The investigation began with a series of gruesome attacks, each victim's life brutally cut short. Detectives were baffled, unsure what to make of the lack of evidence. The killer seemed to be always one step ahead, leaving behind no deaths, no dentist, no signs of forced entry. As the body count rose, detectives became increasingly desperate. They worked around the clock, following every lead, every tip. But every door they knocked on led to a dead end. The killer's modus operandi was eerily consistent. Each victim was a woman, each attack happening in the dead of night. But there was no apparent motive, no connection between the victims. The investigation was at a standstill. Detectives were running out of options, and the community was on edge. The killer seemed to be untouchable, always one step ahead of the law. And then, a breakthrough. A cryptic message from an unknown source hinted at the killer's identity. Detectives were skeptical, but they had no other leads. The message read, "Look closer at the ones who seem innocent." Detectives were unsure what to make of it, but they had to follow every lead. As they dug deeper, they discovered a shocking inconsistency. One of the suspects had a rock-solid alibi for one of the attacks, but something didn't add up. The suspect's alibi checked out, but detectives couldn't shake the feeling that they were being lied to. They decided to investigate further. And that's when things took a dark turn. The suspect's story began to unravel, revealing a web of deceit and manipulation. Detectives were shocked, unsure what to believe. But just as they thought they had the killer cornered, a major twist threw the case into chaos. A new piece of evidence emerged, pointing to a completely different suspect. The investigation was turned on its head. Detectives were set on edge, unsure what to believe. And then, just as they thought they had a breakthrough, everything went black. The killer's next move was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain: the investigation was far from over. The darkness closed in as detectives realized their investigation had just hit a dead end. The new piece of evidence had thrown the case into chaos, and they were back to square one. But they refused to give up. They dug deeper, following every lead, every tip. And then, a new breakthrough. A surveillance camera caught a glimpse of the killer's car, a rare model with a distinctive license plate. Detectives were ecstatic. They tracked down the car's owner, a seemingly ordinary citizen with no connection to the victims. But as they dug deeper, they discovered a shocking revelation. The car's owner had an identical twin brother, a man with a history of violence and a grudge against society. Detectives were stunned. Could this be the killer they had been searching for? As they investigated the twin brother, they uncovered a web of deceit and manipulation that went far beyond the murders. The brother had a history of hacking, identity theft, and sabotage. The stakes were higher than ever as detectives worked to bring the killer to justice. But just as they thought they had a breakthrough, a new twist threw the case into chaos. The twin brother had an alibi for one of the murders, a rock-solid alibi that seemed impossible to fake. Detectives were left wondering, was the twin brother working with someone else, or was he telling the truth? The investigation was turning into a maze of twists and turns, with detectives struggling to keep up. But they refused to give up, driven by a determination to bring the killer to justice. And then, just as they thought they had a lead, everything went dark. The killer's next move was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain. The message on their screen sent a chill down the spines of detectives. "You're getting close, but you'll never catch me." The killer's confidence was unnerving, but detectives refused to back down. They analyzed the message, searching for any clue that might lead them to the killer. And then, a breakthrough. The message was sent from a secure server, but detectives managed to track it down to a specific location. They arrived at the location, an nondescript office building in the heart of the city. But as they entered the building, they were met with a shocking sight. The office was empty, except for a single chair and a small table. On the table, a note read, "Look again at the evidence." Detectives were baffled. What evidence were they missing? As they re-examined the case files, they discovered a major revelation. One of the victims had a connection to the police department, a connection that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. The victim had been a witness in a previous case, a case that had been handled by one of the detectives on the current team. Detectives were stunned. Could this be the connection they had been missing? As they dug deeper, they uncovered a web of deceit and corruption that went far beyond the murders. The detective who had handled the previous case had a secret that could ruin his career. The stakes were higher than ever as detectives worked to uncover the truth. But just as they thought they had a breakthrough, a new twist threw the case into chaos. The detective with the secret was not the only one involved. There were others who had been hiding in plain sight. Detectives were left wondering how many people were involved, and how far did the conspiracy go. The investigation was turning into a complex puzzle, with detectives struggling to piece together the clues. But they refused to give up, driven by a determination to bring the killer to justice. And then, just as they thought they had a lead, everything went dark. The killer's next move was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain: the investigation was far from over. The voice on the phone sent a chill down the spines of detectives. "Look closer at the ones you trust." The words echoed in their minds, making them question everything. Who could they trust? The killer seemed to be always one step ahead, and detectives couldn't shake the feeling that they were being played. As they dug deeper, they discovered a shocking revelation. One of their own colleagues had been secretly working with the killer, feeding them information and helping them evade capture. Detectives were stunned. How could one of their own betray them like this? They arrested the colleague, but the damage had already been done. The killer had managed to stay one step ahead, and the investigation was in shambles. Detectives were left wondering how many more moles were there, and how far did the conspiracy go. As they re-examined the evidence, they discovered a new lead. A mysterious symbol had been found at one of the crime scenes, a symbol that seemed to match an ancient cult. Detectives were baffled. What did the symbol mean? And was the killer part of a larger organization? They began to investigate the cult, following a trail of clues that led them deeper into the shadows. The stakes were higher than ever as detectives worked to unravel the mystery. But just as they thought they had a breakthrough, a new twist threw the case into chaos. The cult was real, but it was not what they expected. It was a front for a larger organization, one that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Detectives were left wondering what was the true purpose of the organization, and how many people were involved. The investigation was turning into a complex web of deceit and conspiracy. And then, just as they thought they had a lead, everything went dark. The killer's next move was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain. The photograph sent shockwaves through the investigation. Who was the colleague, and what did they have to do with the killer? Detectives were determined to find out. They began by questioning the colleague, but they denied any involvement with the killer. However, detectives noticed something strange. The colleague seemed nervous, and their alibi for one of the murders didn't check out. As they dug deeper, they discovered a shocking revelation. The colleague was not who they seemed to be. They were actually an undercover agent, working to take down the organization from the inside. Detectives were stunned. How could they have missed this? They began to question the colleague's handler, but they were met with resistance. The handler claimed that the colleague was a trusted asset, and that they had been working to gather evidence against the organization. But detectives weren't convinced. They knew that the organization was ruthless, and that they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. If the colleague was working undercover, they were in grave danger. As detectives worked to uncover the truth, they received a message from the killer. "You're getting close, but you'll never catch me." The message was accompanied by a video that showed the colleague being taken away by the organization. Detectives were horrified. They knew that they had to act fast, or risk losing the colleague forever. They launched a rescue mission. But it was too late. The colleague was gone, and the organization had vanished into thin air. The investigation was at a dead end, and detectives were left with more questions than answers. Who was behind the organization? And what was their ultimate goal? As they sat in stunned silence, they received a call from an unknown number. "You'll never catch me," the voice on the other end said. "But I'll give you a hint. Look closer at the top." Detectives were left wondering, what did the voice mean? And who was at the top? The game was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The memo sent shockwaves through the police department. What truth were they getting close to? And what did the organization have to do with it? Detectives were determined to find out. They began by investigating the chief of police, but they seemed clean. However, detectives noticed that the chief had been acting strangely in the past few weeks. As they dug deeper, they discovered a shocking revelation. The chief was not who they seemed to be. They were actually a puppet, controlled by a powerful figure behind the scenes. Detectives were stunned. Who was this powerful figure? And what did they want? They began to investigate, following a trail of clues that led them to a surprising suspect. The suspect was a wealthy businessman, known for his ruthless tactics and vast influence. Detectives were shocked. Could this be the mastermind behind the organization? As they dug deeper, they discovered a web of deceit and corruption that went all the way to the top. The businessman had connections to the police department, the government, and even the judiciary. The stakes were higher than ever as detectives worked to bring the businessman to justice. But just as they thought they had a breakthrough, a new twist threw the case into chaos. The businessman had a solid alibi for one of the murders, and detectives began to wonder if they had the wrong suspect. But then, they received a message from the killer. "You're getting close," the message read. "But you're not close enough." The message was accompanied by a photograph of the businessman, standing in front of a luxurious mansion. Detectives were left wondering, was the businessman involved? Or was he just a pawn in a larger game? The investigation was turning into a complex puzzle, with detectives struggling to piece together the clues. And then, just as they thought they had a lead, everything went dark. The voice on the phone echoed in the minds of detectives. "Look in the mirror." What did it mean? Was the killer one of their own? Detectives were baffled. They began to investigate their own colleagues, looking for anyone who might be hiding in plain sight. But as they dug deeper, they discovered a shocking revelation. One of their own colleagues had been acting strangely, and their alibi for one of the murders didn't check out. Detectives were stunned. Could this be the killer? As they questioned the colleague, they discovered a web of deceit and manipulation that went far beyond the murders. The colleague had been working with the organization, feeding them information and helping them evade capture. The stakes were higher than ever as detectives worked to bring the colleague to justice. But just as they thought they had a breakthrough, a new twist threw the case into chaos. The colleague was not the mastermind behind the organization. There was someone else, someone who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Detectives were left wondering, who was this person? And what did they want? As they dug deeper, they discovered a shocking revelation. The mastermind behind the organization was someone they had trusted, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. The investigation was turning into a complex puzzle, with detectives struggling to piece together the clues. And then, Just as they thought they had a lead, everything went dark. The killer's next move was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain: the investigation was far from over. The photograph sent shockwaves through the investigation. Was the lead detective really the killer? The team was torn apart by doubt and suspicion. As they investigated their own colleague, they discovered a shocking revelation. The lead detective had been acting strangely in the months leading up to the murders. They had been distant, preoccupied, and had made several mistakes that seemed out of character. But just as they thought they had enough evidence, a new twist threw the case into chaos. The lead detective was found dead in their apartment, a victim of murder. The investigation was now more complex than ever. Who had killed the lead detective? And why? Was it the killer, or was it someone else? As detectives dug deeper, they discovered a cryptic message on the lead detective's phone. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." The message seemed to suggest that the lead detective had been manipulated, but by whom? The team was on edge, unsure of who to trust. They knew they had to work together to catch the killer, but the photograph and the message had created a sense of unease. As they continued to investigate, they discovered a shocking revelation. The killer was not just one person, but a group of people. A group that had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating the investigation, and using the lead detective to further their own agenda. The stakes were higher than ever as detectives worked to bring the group to justice. But just as they thought they had a breakthrough, a new twist threw the case into chaos. The group was not just any group. It was a highly organized and sophisticated organization, with tentacles reaching into every level of society, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. The voice on the phone sent a chill down the spines of detectives. "You'll never be able to stop us." The threat was clear, and detectives knew they had to. They began to investigate the organization, following a trail of clues that led them deeper into the shadows. They discovered that the organization was a highly sophisticated and well-funded entity, with operatives all over the world. As they dug deeper, they discovered a shocking revelation. The organization was not just a random group of individuals, but a highly structured and organized entity with a clear hierarchy and chain of command. The stakes were higher than ever as detectives worked to take down the organization. But just as they thought they had a breakthrough, a new twist threw the case into chaos. One of the detectives was approached by a mysterious figure who claimed to have information about the organization. The figure was cryptic and refused to reveal their identity, but they seemed to know a lot about the organization. The detective was torn. Could they trust this mysterious figure, or were they just playing them? They decided to take a chance and meet with the figure again. As they met with the figure, they discovered a shocking revelation. The figure was a former member of the organization, and they had information that could bring down the entire organization. But just as they thought they had a breakthrough, the figure was kidnapped by the organization. Detectives were left wondering, would they be able to rescue the figure, or would they become the organization's next victim? The investigation was now a desperate race against time. Detectives knew they had to act fast, or risk losing everything. The message from the kidnapper sent a chill down the spines of detectives. They knew they had to act fast if they wanted to save their colleague. They arrived at the old warehouse at midnight, guns drawn and hearts racing. As they entered the warehouse, they were met with a shocking sight. Their colleague was tied to a chair, a look of terror on their face. But that was not the only shocking thing. Behind the colleague stood the mastermind behind the organization, a smile spreading across their face. "You'll never win," the mastermind said. "We've been planning this for years, and nothing can stop us now." Detectives were stunned. They had been so close to catching the mastermind, but now they were facing a desperate last stand. The mastermind revealed that they had been manipulating the entire investigation. using their vast resources and network to stay one step ahead of the law. They had even planted evidence to throw detectives off their trail. But just as the mastermind was about to reveal their plan, a group of SWAT officers burst into the warehouse, guns blazing. The mastermind was caught off guard, and in the ensuing chaos they were shot and killed. The colleague was rescued, shaken but alive. As detectives breathed a sigh of relief, they realized that the case was far from over. The organization may have been dismantled, but there were still many questions left unanswered. As detectives sat in the interrogation room, questioning the last remaining member of the organization, they received a surprise. The member revealed that the organization was just a small part of a much larger conspiracy, one that went all the way to the top of the government. The detective's eyes widened in shock as the member continued to reveal more information. "You're just scratching the surface," they said. "There's so much more to uncover." The detective's phone rang, and they answered it. "What do you mean?" they asked. But the line was dead. The investigation was far from over, and the truth was more sinister than they ever could have imagined.